Hello, everyone. Welcome to another afternoon session of Toronto Machine Learning Summit 2020. My name is Nadia, and I work at NILAS as a senior machine learning engineer. Today, I'm honored to be here to have the opportunity to introduce another of our amazing speakers. Before starting, I would like to remind you that question, please post it in the chat. I will collect all the questions and ask them directly to our speaker after the presentation. Our speaker is Joe Greenwood. Joe's career has been focused on building and scaling data-driven products, services, and businesses. Joe is Vice President of Data Strategy for North America at Mastercard, with responsibility for realizing Mastercard's global strategy and data responsibility imperative across all business lines in North America, and enabling the growth of new services through region and product-specific data strategies. Previously, Joe was lead executive of data at Mars Discovery District in Toronto, North America's largest urban innovation hub dedicated to growing Canada's tech sector. At Mars, Joe founded and led the data practice, building strategic partnerships to scale Canadian data and AI businesses in sectors, including retail, finance, energy, and healthcare. Joe has also held a leadership role in product development for location-based data product and web services at Ordnance Survey in the UK, and for secure real-time mobile data services at BlackBerry. Joe holds a master's degree in geographical information science from the University of Edinburgh and an MBA from Manchester Business School, and is a certified analytics professional and a privacy and access by design ambassador. Please join me in welcoming Joe Greenwood.
Hey, thanks, Natalia, and thank you everyone for joining. I'm impressed that we're all here again for another online session. I know our lives are dominated by looking at screens and dialing in from wherever we are, so taking the time to engage. I'm also very impressed by the whole Toronto Machine Learning Summit lineup this year. It's been a great opportunity to share some experiences and learn from many people. And in that spirit, very happy to share the kind of journey we've been on at Mastercard as we globally try to understand how best to scale our machine learning and AI models, and what it's taken us to do that, what we've learned along the way. And because this is in the data strategy and the business strategy track of the conference, I'm going to concentrate more on how do we frame the business problem? How do we understand the data that goes into our models? And what do we do to appropriately manage the modeling process to make sure we get the results we hope for in all the different countries or different regions we're operating in, and we avoid some of the negatives that can happen from AI. So I won't touch as much on, say, the more technical algorithm or the computer science parts, as important as those are, but rather the data and the business processes which wrap around that to get the results at a global scale from what technology now allows us to do. And so, to share a little bit, so why is Mastercard looking at how we can take this globally? Well, obviously, if we're Mastercard, we have a global business and a global set of operations. But also, AI and machine learning now has applications in nearly every part of our business. And our business is very varied around the world. I'm sure yours is too. And I'm sure in different ways, you're trying to grapple with similar challenges of how do we see the global opportunity that we see? How can we bring efficiency to do that from a global platform or a global product, rather than having to design anew each time we expand our business? Also, we all know, of course, that models benefit from the data that goes in them. So if we can deploy a consistent model or a consistent framework in many places, we benefit from scale and variety of data, which improves the model itself. And so I'm going to talk about some examples as we go through. I'm going to draw on examples like fraud and how we manage fraud, on economic modeling and understanding the patterns in the economy, on consumer preference modeling that we use in things like loyalty programs, advertising solutions, and also on credit decisions. Because all of these have a real need to, one, solve on a global scale, and two, be very sensitive to the fact that the patterns in every market and in every community might be very different. And so I invite you also to pause and maybe think about your own business. What is it? What's the business problem you're trying to work on that has in it inherently a global opportunity and maybe some very local nuance you've got to deal with along the way? If you're inclined, put them in the chat. I'll try and respond to those as I go through. I'd be interested to see and just to understand what kind of problems you work on. But to give you a flavour of the kind of problems that we work on and I work on at Mastercard, things like fraud is a global phenomenon. A lot of fraud happens across country borders, but also the way in which fraud happens varies enormously by country and by community. How it happens online versus in person. Who's affected most? Who kind of perpetrates that most, or who's most responsible? Huge variation in that. And we want to be able to capture that and respond to that in real time. In economic modeling, we want to be able to help support very local and regional economies. And right now, nearly every economy is responding to major global events. So that requires us to, one, have comparability and a global scale to our thinking and our models, but also be able to capture all the unique drivers which are happening in each local city, each company right now, so we can help merchants, we can help governments, and we can help banks respond to what is turning out to be a global crisis, but a very set of localized impacts. And in consumer preference modeling, we have many customers who are trying to scale global products and services. They might have global marketing campaigns, they might have global rewards, yet preferences and how people want to participate and use those products vary very distinctly, even within a country and within communities. So we want models which can scale globally and reflect that local nuance. Lastly, around credit decisions. So many credit lines or product lines like a credit card or lines of credit, personal credit or business credit, are actually global businesses. They may be banks who operate across multiple countries in, say, Europe, or across the region in somewhere like Asia Pacific. So they want to be able to deploy a global model across that region or across those many countries, but respect the fact that there may be very localized laws or localized factors which determine credit. And so we kind of we all know that there's a real business benefit, and we also know there's some hidden costs. So if a model isn't accurate locally, you may miss the opportunity. So in credit, you end up missing the opportunity to provide credit when you could have done, or you end up with a credit portfolio that has more risk than you wanted. So we kind of get there's a risk from a business perspective and a value. The important thing to also realize is that there's a human cost, or there's a human risk to every decision we make using machine learning or AI. And so that human cost and that human risk cannot be hidden, and it should not be hidden. And so our purpose here is to work out how do we design in and think about those human factors from the very start, from how we frame the business problem, how we find the right data that goes into it, and how we deploy and scale that model across multiple countries or across multiple communities. So it's important to understand what drives bias and what drives differences in accuracy in a model. And a lot of this is reflected in the data that comes in. So being able to recognize that there are often cognitive biases in the data we use to train it. There could be even biases in the data we train on, in how well, in terms of the selection bias of the data we've picked that represent the phenomena we're interested in. We're also interested in bias and outcomes. So even if we've accounted for and we understand the bias in the data, how's that in terms of who is impacted? Which group is impacted more or less? Is it acceptable that different groups are impacted? So if we're trying to help governments or cities right now respond to changes in their economy, how do we ensure that those are inclusive changes, those are inclusive supports, and we understand which parts of the community will benefit from what types of sports or what types of changes we have to do? And so again, as you are thinking about the kinds of business problems or opportunities you're looking at that are global, also think now, what is the human element to every single one of those opportunities or every decision you're trying to automate? Is it a customer who's impacted? Is it your employee? Is it your supplier? Is it a member of the general public? And how can you represent their interests, and how do you take account of the fact that there will be a human component to what you're doing? And how do you start to design that in? So for us at the highest level to do so, we started to think about the kind of principles that were required. The kind of principles to make sure that we understand that we can make a correct decision without impacting very specific classes who may have protected status. Or that we can look at fraud patterns and make sure that we provide protection to everyone, to every business or every consumer, without unduly challenging those particular groups, because they may be more susceptible to fraud and be more likely to be a victim of that. So we want to provide support without unduly singling any group out. So for us to address the human aspect of this and to realize that a lot of the source of this is actually a data and a process perspective, we established what we termed our global data responsibility imperative. So this is a public statement of the principles that we believe have to be centered to all of our business practices. They're communicated to all staff, they're communicated publicly, and we work with a sort of consortium across industry to understand what it takes to implement these in practice at scale. And so at the center of those is a commitment around data ownership. So at its core is the idea that consumers should own their data, they should control its use, and they should benefit from the products and services built on that data. And lastly, all of us who then use that data have a responsibility to protect it. Around that are the principles about how we work. So this is about establishing the highest standards globally that are appropriate, recognizing that in every jurisdiction or in every country, the legal requirement may vary, or the cultural requirement may vary, but a belief that every consumer should benefit from the same high standards of care of their data. And some of these have distinct local characteristics, and there's a distinct local context to how you let and operationalize some of these principles. So if we think about things around data ownership, the notion of ownership of data may vary. So this is really about saying it's a moral right of ownership, whereas in different countries, actually this is far nearer to required legal practice. So if you're operating, say, in Europe or in California, then this is actually much nearer to required business practice. And in Canada, with the kind of recent passing of the legislation going forward this week around the digital charter, we're actually much nearer to those same principles becoming required far more explicitly than we were before. But we also have to think about control. What does it mean for consumers with very different levels of data literacy and different levels of access to actually assert control over their data? And how do we therefore put appropriate designs into the product or service which is using their data or making a decision on their behalf? There are also some of these principles which have a very regional context to them. So things like integrity. Integrity refers to the integrity of the data that goes in. So understanding quality and say the temporal accuracy and the coverage is essential to then ensuring that that product and that service and that model works. When we think about things around privacy and security, so how can we establish the highest standards of privacy and security globally? Again, recognizing they may vary by region. But also, how do you deploy a model where you may have very specific controls? You may have data localization requirements or on-soil requirements. You may also be deploying a model to generate positive impact, deliberately using data to enable financial inclusion or economic recovery. So what that means in each country or in a developed country versus a developing country are very different. So this is around how we set that at the highest level and embedded that into every kind of project and team. So then to get that down a level and to actually start to get to something operationalized, you need to be fairly consistent in how you develop the strategy to design the data to go into the model. And for us, that is all underpinned by the same data responsibility principles. They're kind of the foundation for what we do. And then each of the kind of pillars of that are essentially a very robust data framework. And the important reason for why you need consistency is if you've got many teams working on global products and global services, and you've also got teams working on many local products and services, at some point, those all have to join up. If you've got a sheer volume of development happening, and a pace of change and innovation, unless you have a consistent framework, you're not going to be able to keep up with that. If you've got a model you're trying to take to potentially hundreds of countries, the consistency of framework is required so you can do the localization, we can do the data quality, the data sourcing and design work, and review kind of the important characteristics as we go through AI governance. And so without a kind of framework that guides that, we wouldn't be able to maintain the same standards of care and put the same principles to work. And when you were looking at the kind of human characteristics, the human impact and local accuracy, there's three of these components that stand out as being most important to understand at each regional level. And that's being able to understand the data sourcing, data quality, and some of the AI governance choices that are required. So when you think about data sourcing, if you're looking at, say, an economic model, the event data which goes in is obviously critical to making sure the model responds correctly to what's happening locally. If you're looking at macroeconomic trends, again, being able to correlate macro trends to your sample, in our case, the payment network sample, it's important to ensure that we understand the validity and the background of all of those data sources. If you're looking at credit variables, by region and by country, what you're allowed to use will vary. What you're allowed to use in Europe will also vary. The permissions that go with that, and being able to actually know that you have the lineage and the authority to use data right the way through your chain is essential before putting a new model to work in a different country. Data quality is also the next kind of critical piece here. So temporal and geographic coverage tend to be what we have to think most of and most about when we put a new model to work in a different country. So a deliberate set of tests and a rigorous framework by which we assess that for every data set that's used in every model that gets deployed. When we think about things like credit, a lot of credit models are now being driven by what we think of as alternative data. So this is data that may come from your transactional history, it may come from telephone records, it may come from many other sources. Assessing quality here becomes really critical because those vary significantly by location, and the legal requirements will also vary by location significantly. And then when we look at AI governance, often this is around understanding culture and context. What is appropriate to do and what the risks are for different groups will vary by different geography. So we actually require that different steps of our governance processes are repeated as we scale a project, scale a product, and scale a model to different countries. So get a little bit more granular on that specifically around AI governance. So on the right-hand side is a very high-level pictorial summary of our AI governance framework. And you'll notice it encompasses both data and the model. So the fundamental point here is that model governance and data governance have to be joined. That has to be an integrated activity if you're going to successfully govern how the model behaves and the impact it has when you deploy it to different markets. So our model here is a 9-step process. It requires that to be followed because it's baked into the product development cycle, it's baked into the software development cycle. It's also supported by tools and processes and assessment guides. Because one of the key things behind this is being able to upskill all staff and all modelers, all our data engineers, and all our product owners to be able to understand the nuances involved in AI governance and what happens if their model goes around the world. There's also peer review and escalation points in this, because one of the important sources of bias is also our own internal biases. So by making some of the judgments and some of the decisions around AI governance explicit, by making them shared, you actually start to address some of those sources of inherent bias. So hopefully it gives you a flavor of what is involved in our AI governance and also a reminder of why this is important. So going back to our principles, one of which is accountability. AI governance lets us take a public statement of our principle of accountability and transfer that into internal accountability at every level to every role involved in building an AI model. And so when we look at AI governance from a regional perspective, and we're taking a model and we're deploying it into new countries, into new markets, It actually requires us to step back. We actually step back to the two first questions I asked at the beginning, which were, what is the problem we're trying to solve? And what is the human at the center of that decision? Because the purpose for deploying a model is very regionally and culturally contextual. We have to ask ourselves, which population is being addressed? Are there unique harms different types of people experience in different countries? So credit models may exclude or include different groups or communities. An economic model which identifies support or identifies growth opportunities or identifies opportunities to restrict activity in the case of a pandemic will have very different impacts on particular individuals. So we have to actually go back and ask those questions, because a key part of AI governance is essentially understanding the risk and the impact of risk. And those impacts occur on people. So the framing of our business question has to be revisited as we deploy a model to a new market. The next kind of key pieces we've touched on a little bit here is around data sourcing. So in a regional context, you need to make sure that we have enough data that can actually train the model to represent the unique characteristics of that market. We also have to make sure there's enough volume of data and variety, that the sampling is correct to represent those. This is often also where we look at synthetic data and other techniques which let us sample data differently to get to sufficient coverage. Or we look at very localized data partnerships with other people who can provide us data that sufficiently addresses the local market. We also have to think carefully about sensitive data. So typically this is things like gender, race, sexual orientation, or other consumer preferences, which may be explicit or implicit. So important to understand that what those variables are, again, may vary by country. So in India, this idea of caste may be very different from notions of class or race in other countries. So we need to understand that those are present in different markets. We need to be able to, one, ask ourselves, are they truly required for the decision? And therefore minimize those variables and their importance in the decision. But also have them to hand, because if we're going to try and assess the impact of bias, we do need to know how much our decisions and how much the model varies by those variables, even if they're not an explicit part. And we also need to know if many of the variables that may be latent or hidden in our data correlate to some of those sensitive factors. So really important to understand how those sensitive data can be used, that they are present and they're used for model validation and testing, if not decisions. And this goes to the last bit around understanding impact. So often in bias, we think about different measures for understanding bias and creating methods for assessing fairness, be that things like independence, separation, or sufficiency. But in a regional context, there's two important points here. One is the measure may be different, and also the minimum standard may vary. So in one market, we may pick a model, a way or method of assessing fairness, and we may set a different threshold for that same model deployed into a different country. And that represents the level of variation in the market. It represents the level of risk in a different market. But those judgment calls around what is fair and what is acceptable actually are human judgments. They go back to the first part of our question around purpose evaluation. Why were we making this decision and who is impacted? And so we have to revisit that as we scale. Next part is around management. So if you've created a model and you now realize it's having to respond to very different characteristics in different markets, it may have different weights or assessments attached to it to account for different levels of fairness or different characteristics of that. You now need to start to automate that. So we need to plan for how do we keep up with the need to recalibrate and retrain a model for every market. And we need to automate the process by which we track fairness, and we need to track the impacts that are made. Some have referred to this as AI for AI, but essentially it's being able to write automated models that track how your model varies as it's deployed to many markets. And so what we start to realize is that being able to make sure models perform well in every market is both a global problem and a regional problem. And it's one that's actually way more than just the statistical measure of fairness or the statistical measure of data and the correction of those factors. It's a realization that our toolbox for managing local model performance and how we view that through bias and measures of fairness start from how we frame the problem, how we frame what the decision represents in human terms. It goes through to how we understand the data and how well the data represent those driving variables in a different market. Our toolbox for understanding bias also looks at quality. It understands and starts to forecast what level of quality will impact what level of performance and fidelity in a given model. Only then do we start to really get to models and to think about how does the algorithm itself actually track and calibrate itself for different levels of fairness, or gives us information that helps us assess that. And so it's not a surprise then to realize that because bias is in itself inherently a very human thing, it's a human cause, it has a human impact, a lot of the solutions here are very human as well. They're around making judgments explicit. They're around steps to understand human decisions on model performance. And they're around being able to make sure that we have strong governance steps which make that explicit. And they also help us, sorry, I was looking at one of your questions. They also help us to realize that the principles that we're looking at vary by region and vary by market. So think of this as a toolbox. Think of it about how you frame the problem and how you frame your approach to solving it as much as the statistical techniques and the measures we employ in the model itself. And so to wrap up, to realize some of the benefits of global models, there's a lot at stake. And there's a lot of very nuanced aspects around how we think about data and how we think about the human impact of how that data is used. In its highest level, what we distill this down into is being able to establish principles which go above and beyond us to establish a higher global standard, to create consistency in how we work so we can repeatedly take a model from a global context to a local and vice versa, and how we incorporate bias mitigation, not just in algorithm design or model design, but actually in the business problem and in the data strategy and the data design that feeds the model. And that's important because you can see from the examples that lets us create great benefits from the models we deploy. It lets us have economic models that genuinely allow comparisons across locations. We help about 100 governments or cities right now respond in real time to the economic changes. And our fraud models start for them to be able to adapt to different regions and different cross-border flows. And so I hope those same principles you can see might help you gain, one, the global scale, but also the local fidelity and the local accuracy you're looking for in some of the problems that you were sharing earlier. So with that, I hope I've managed to enlighten you on not just the algorithm side of global scale, but of the human process required and the data processes required to get to global scale and local accuracy. Thank you. So I'm just going to read a couple of the questions out. So Martine, how do you operationalize your AI governance? And I think that's about to do the question, which is great. I can take the bottom one if you want to scan through the rest of that. So how do you operate your AI governance framework, centralized tooling, monitoring? So the picture in there between local and global. So inherently, from a process perspective, this is global. So that means it gets tied into our global product framework, our global project frameworks. There are also global teams, of which I'm a part, which look at and review models which come through. From a tool set perspective, that will vary a lot by the product team, the technology stack, and where in the world it's being operationalized. So I would say the technical stuff varies more by region, depending on how they, or by product line more. So how we engineer the governance and monitoring into fraud model will depend on the fraud technology stack separate from, say, the consumer preference stack. So that's what tends to vary by product line. I hope that answers that question.
Okay, if you want, I can read the question for you, or you can go
Sure.
through the chat. Okay, so let's start from the first one. The first one was the question of algorithm bias, for example, racial bias different among countries. How do global models address these local differences?
So one is to recognize, so a model may have different measures of bias in different countries. We would look to assess what is the extent of the bias that may be present by looking at the data that goes in on a country basis. You may then if the model is the same, you might set a different threshold for how you interpret the answer from that model. So if it's a risk score, then the action you take may vary because you recognize that there's a different level of bias or sensitivity on that. Or you may actually then start to put different weights or use models in ensemble differently to reach a different decision. So there's different ways that would be addressed depending on, one, the nature of bias and the extent of that.
Okay, so moving to the second one, if you have follow-up question, please post it in the chat. So the second question is, why do developers in countries different from the US replicate the same biases in design and development as US developers? Is there a monoculture in AI system development?
Let me understand that question. Good question. So I don't know if that's a general question, or I can comment from a Mastercard perspective. So a lot of our AI development is global, so we have different teams in different regions of the world developing AI. But one of the concerns is more outside Mastercard, let's say, but more broadly, is that we have essentially a monoculture in those that are developing the models. So one, that may be true in terms of the methodology it's using. I think, therefore, if you don't realize, because you've developed a model in one country, that your data and your subjects are going to vary by country, then you're going to be blind to the fact that cultures just weren't aware of the variation. So for us, the way we address that is by engaging our local design teams and our local customers. So the only way you can really get over that is to deeply know your local market and deeply know the characteristics of that market, to make a judgment to realize that this isn't going to generalize without significant adaptation. Whether that's a US-centric specific problem, or I can say, right, that is a risk that I think developers in any country face. The solution to that is about being able to deploy local knowledge and expertise. In fact, part of my role and the roles of like mine around the world are to bring that to our teams. So that we can find out what is very different in the market they're about to deploy in from the market that maybe where they are based or where the product was originally developed. So I hope that gives you a sense of how we address it, but also how it may generalize across the industry.
Okay, so moving to the next one, we still have 3 questions. Many AI development teams are international, located in countries that are different than the target market. How do we deal with biases that are inherent to the developers from their country but are problematic for the market that they are building for?
Great question. So I guess we're all biased in different ways. So the developers may be in one country developing a model level. So it's actually about methodology in part. So the reason we've codified what we look for in the evaluation stages and what we look for in the data use stages is because it makes explicit what the measures of bias we expect to be documented are. It makes explicit the steps that we expect to go through and how that should be shared with peers. And if you make peer reviews global, so the peer who's reviewing a new model, maybe in a different country with a different perspective, then you can deliberately bring different perspectives to bear on that problem. You're recognizing that some of the bias comes from our own cultural biases, the bias. So that's one part internally, how we can address that. The other one comes a little bit to what I spoke to before. Have very good local knowledge of the data, of the local regulations, of population characteristics, because we have teams in the market, or we have customers in the market, or we have deliberate sampling and data sourcing to represent the market, means we're more likely to systematically uncover the differences of those markets than just relying on our own gut feel from, say, sitting only in Canada or wherever we are. I hope that addresses that and gives you a sense of the mixer of both process, data, and people strategies to address that.
Okay, thank you for your answer. So next question is, can you highlight the differences and similarities between the local and the global model, I guess?
Sure. So I guess what they might have in common is they're using a common architecture in terms of data architecture or algorithmic architecture. Then they will be using a similar neural network, let's say, or a similar set of models used on Ensemble together, with the chaining of decisions that are being made. So that's what may be similar, and that's what may be global in nature. What therefore may be different is how different features in those models are represented and weighted by country or by market, how different models which are used in Ensemble may be related to each other. What may also be different is how we then calibrate or adjust the output from those models, and we interpret them in a decision. So we first establishing thresholds, or we're using different categories to interpret the outcome. So that lets us adjust, therefore, what was still a relatively global logic base to very different feature sets and very different logical requirements at the local level. So hopefully that gives you an idea of that. That's a machine learning kind of view on that. You may also see that as different product lines. So for us, that will manifest itself in a global product and maybe regional specific instances of the product.
Okay, thank you. So some people is thanking you for your answer in the chat, and we now have the last question. So could you give an example of a localized model? What's the difference? I'm concerned that some practice in other countries, while acceptable, can still lead to bias and discrimination. You mentioned one of them, class caste in India.
Yes, a good one. Actually, another one in fraud, where it's highly localized model, and where, for example, we can't generalize actually, is around fraud in certain parts of the Middle East, and that's not to call out anything particular about it. It's just there are just different ways that we're able to track that because of banking regulations or because of how data is represented, or how fraud tends to be perpetrated in person versus online differently. That would be an example of actually where a bespoke local model is more effective. So that's one. And then you're right, exactly. The concern, and we share that concern, practices in one country acceptable in another. And so that's really at the heart of going back to our risk assessment. One, evaluating the purpose and evaluating the risk in terms of how well do we meet that purpose and what is acceptable in that country. And so it's about being able to be aware of that. So that would be an example of how we address that very different cultural context through two people. One, through a process, so basically evaluating purpose and risk. And secondly, through deliberately localization of a model to represent those features which are more important or to test for.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So we don't have any other question. So I think we can close the session here. Thank you so much, Joe. It was really an interesting discussion. And yeah, thank you from TMLS. Thanks.
Thank you.